All right, dear friends, I think we're going to get started, and then I'm sure more people shall join us
What
in a few
happened to
minutes.
Phil? Should we wait
Can
for
you
him?
hear
Phil's
me?
here.
He's here?
Nancy,
Yep,
can you
Phil's
hear
here.
me?
Oh, no. See, I can only now. I'm not looking at the list of participants, but now I see you. Okay, good.
Nancy, Mary, Phil, and Filiz, the four of you will be projected and pinned so everyone can see all four of you in seconds.
Okay.
But I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this first seminar of the Immigration Seminar Series for Spring 2022. I can't believe it's 2022 already, but here we are. We have an exciting lineup of 4 different events, and I hope that you join us for the other event coming up. At this point, I just want to introduce our graduate student coordinator, Dakota Ross Krabber, who will be introducing our panel and the speakers and also moderate the event. It is going to be recorded because so many of our friends and colleagues who want to be here can't be here because of teaching and because of grandparenting duties. So here we are. So Dakota is on yours.
Thank you. It's so nice to see everyone. Sorry, my screen is being split in 3 different directions. So it's wonderful to see everyone. Like Van said, welcome to Spring 2022 against all odds. I'm really excited to introduce our speakers today for the session, One Quarter of the Nation, Immigration, and the Transformation of America. So Professor Nancy Foner will be speaking about her book, and Filiz, Garip, Philip Kasinitz, and Mary C. Waters will be panelists. Before this introductions, I would just like to share the format of the seminar. So first, we're going to hear from Professor Foner for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then our panelists will speak for about 15 minutes each, and then the rest of the time will be until 6 p.m. for Q&A. I'm going to moderate, so if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat, and you can let me know which panelist or speaker you would like the question to be answered by. So a brief introduction. Dr. Nancy Foner is a distinguished professor of sociology at Hunter College and CUNY's Graduate Center. Her recent work has focused on comparing immigration in the US today and in the past, immigrant minorities in the US and Europe, and how immigration has been remaking American society. She's written extensively on immigration to New York City, past and present, as well as Jamaican migration to New York and London, especially on issues of race and ethnicity, gender, and family dynamics. Dr. Foner is the author and editor of the author or editor of 20 books, the most recent of which is One Quarter of the Nation, Immigration and Transformation of America. She is the recipient of numerous honors, including the 2010 Distinguished Career Award from the International Migration section of the American Sociological Association and the 2018 Merit Award from the ESS. And she was also awarded a Berlin Prize Fellowship at the American Academy in Berlin in 2017 and a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship 2017 to 18. Our panelist, Filiz Garip, is professor of sociology and public affairs at Princeton University. Her research lies at the intersection of migration, economic sociology, and inequality. She studies the mechanisms that enable or constrain mobility and lead to greater or lesser degrees of social and economic inequality. Her work has been published in journals such as American Journal of Sociology, Demography, Population and Development Review, and Sociological Methods and Research. Her book, On the Move, Changing Mechanisms of Mexico-US Migration, has won 3 Best Book Awards. Philip Kasinitz is the Presidential Professor of Sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center. He was the director of the program in International Migration Studies from 2018 to 2019, and he chaired the CUNY doctoral program in sociology since 2001 to 2011 and 2014 to 2017. He specializes in immigration, ethnicity, race relations, urban social life, and the nature of contemporary cities. He's the author of Caribbean New York, for which he won the Thomas and Zeniecki Book Award in 1996, and he co-authored his co-authored book, Inheriting the City, The Children of Immigrants Come of Age, won the ESS's Mira Komrovsky Book Award in 2009 and the ASA Distinguished Scholarly Book Award in 2010. And finally, last but not least, Mary C. Waters is the PZK Professor of Arts and Sciences and the John L. Loeb Professor of Sociology at Harvard University. Her work has focused on the integration of immigrants and their children, the transition to adulthood for the children of immigrants, intergroup relations, the measurement and meaning of racial and ethnic identity, and social, demographic, and psychological impact of natural disasters. She is the author or co-author of 11 books and over 75 articles. Her study on the children of immigrants inheriting the city, the second generation comes of age, with Philip Kasinitz, John Mollenkoff, and Jennifer Holliday, won the 2010 ASA Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Award, and a handful of other awards. And Waters is currently the chair of National Academy of Sciences panel on the integration of immigrants into American society, and she is collaborating on a study with the role of government assistance in the integration of Latino immigrants in 3 American cities. So that's a lot. You all are very accomplished. I'm going to pass it to, oh, and I wanted also to mention that we also have some exciting sponsorship, and we're very thankful for our co-sponsors. So the PhD program in sociology and the MA program in international migration studies. So thank you so much to all of our wonderful sponsors and speakers. And I'm going to turn it over to Nancy.
Okay. Right. So is this gonna, yes. But you're not gonna keep this thing on while I'm speaking. Right?
No, yeah, I will stop sharing.
Okay, stop sharing.
Let me just find the button.
Right. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. I want to thank you. Where's Van Tran? I want to thank for organizing the event, and I want to thank Filiz and Phil and Mary, a very distinguished panel, right, with many books and many honors for being willing to serve as discussants and panelists, and of course everybody for being and coming here today. So, so I want to get right to it, to give a kind of overview of the book, to set out so you get an idea of what it's about and what the main themes of the book. So immigration's impact on this country, and that is the theme and obviously the topic of the book, has become so much a part of daily life that we sometimes fail to see it. And that's deceptive because the changes in the years since 1965 have been far-reaching and profound. Indeed, it's fair to say that they've transformed large portions of our culture and our institutions. And the numbers alone are extraordinary. You know, I say these numbers all the time, and then I say them again, and I'm always, they seem extraordinary to me every time I say them. By 2020, an unprecedented 45 million immigrants were living in the US, the largest numbers since census records have been kept. Together with their children, they've totaled nearly 86 million, accounting for 26% of the nation's population, or more than a quarter of the country. It's the equivalent of absorbing the entire population of Germany and then some. Up to now, however, much of the discussion of contemporary immigration's impact, especially in sociology, has focused on how it changes the lives of immigrants. And in fact, most of my own work up until now has focused on how immigration has changed the lives of immigrants and their children. But I take a different approach in this book, focusing on how immigration has transformed American culture and society, and taking a big picture view through a national perspective and examining a number of key economic, social, and cultural domains. And I want to go through some of that. Okay, so let me start with race. Few things have changed this country's racial picture more conspicuously than the last 50 years of immigration. For much of the 20th century, race was mostly a matter of Black and white. If we go back to 1960, fully 85% of Americans were white. When most Americans thought of minorities, they had Black people in mind. Hispanics were a mere 3.5% of the US residents, that's again in 1960, and Asians were barely visible at less than 1%. Today, whites, non-Hispanic whites alone, have shrunk to around 60% of the population. Hispanics are now the largest minority group at 19%, and Asians are 6%. While the same percent today are Black, almost a tenth are immigrants, with the overwhelming majority from Africa and the Caribbean. This, in turn, has led to astonishing changes in the composition of some of our largest cities. Even in cities that already had substantial Hispanic populations, the numbers exploded in the last half century owing to immigration and to births. Just the city of Los Angeles, to give one example, went from less than 10% Hispanic in 1960 to nearly half by 2019. Miami-Dade County is in a class all by its own. It's now a Latino global metropolitan giant, 69% Hispanic, up from about 5% in 1960. Altogether in US central cities, by 2010, nearly a quarter of the residents were Hispanic, up from 3% in 1970. And the proportion in the suburbs has mushroomed as well. In the South, the old Black-white binary is being altered by the growing Hispanic as well as Asian inflows. Asian Americans have not only grown by leaps and bounds in cities like New York and Los Angeles, which of course have long had Chinatowns in them and substantial, well, it's really relatively small, the Chinese populations, the Chinese Chinatowns were relatively small, but they've multiplied. The Asian American population has multiplied in places where they were hardly present half a century ago. For example, Minneapolis, Las Vegas, and Houston. Also striking is the decline of all white neighborhoods in metropolitan areas, a development in which immigration has played a significant role. In a study of neighborhoods of 24 highly diverse metropolitan areas in the year 2000, only a quarter of the more than 1,200 neighborhoods that had been all white in 1980 remained all white in 2000, and that's 2000, no, only 20 years. Immigration has also had a role in the big growth in mixed marriages, since a great many involve second-generation Hispanics and Asian Americans. And in addition, they're producing a growing number of multiracial children. Immigration has not only created a new demographic reality, but it's also altered how Americans think about race. East Asians, once considered the yellow peril in a common popular view, have now, in another common popular view, are seen often as a model minority, even though, as spiking hate crimes during the pandemic powerfully remind us, they're still subject to racial prejudice and discrimination. Immigration has changed the very words we use to talk about race. The very category Hispanic is a modern day invention, rarely used 50 years ago, and it's now an established category of identity among non-Hispanics, as well as many with origins in Latin America, along with the terms Latino and most recently Latinx. While systemic racism against Black people is all too persistent, immigrants, and in Todd Hamilton's phrase, are remaking Black America. Now about 10% of Black America, and with their children around a fifth. Actually, that's a pretty astounding figure. I think people are not aware of that. We can talk, we really won't have a chance to talk that much about why that's about that, but I think that is a kind of amazing figure. There's a greater awareness among many Americans, both Black and non-Black, of ethnic or national origin differences within the Black population. And this is especially so in cities where Black immigrants have become a significant presence. And this includes New York and the Miami areas. They are the areas with the largest Black immigrant populations, but also places like Minneapolis and Lewiston, Maine, where Africans are highly visible drivers of increases in the overall Black population. And the African migration has really taken off since the 1990s, and it has really grown very significantly. And immigration has affected how the white majority sees itself. Although whites of European origin are still associated with privilege in the US and often take their white identity for granted, many whites have become increasingly aware of themselves as one racial group in an increasingly diverse America. Around a fifth of white Americans, according to some evidence, have not just become more conscious of their whiteness, but also feel that whites' dominant position is under threat, in part owing to the decline in the proportion of whites, as well as economic, political, and occupational gains of non-white groups. Another domain where immigration has had a huge impact is in electoral politics. For one thing, immigrant origin voters have helped transform both the Democratic and Republican electoral coalitions. And I say, again, I don't have time to go into all this, but it's obviously there are other factors involved, but immigration has been one of them. As late as 1980, more whites in the US identified as Democrats than as Republicans. By 2010, it was the reverse. At the same time, the Democratic Party has increasingly become a party supported by non-whites. By 2019, according to a Pew survey, racial minorities made up 40% of registered voters who identified with or leaned toward the Democratic Party. Immigration has been pivotal in these changes. On one side, it's been critical in the large growth in the share of minority registered voters in the national electorate, from 15 to 30% between 1996 and 2019. And they've trended Democratic. In national elections, Hispanics and Asians, for example, 2/3 or more have voted Democratic. Blacks vote, 90% Democrat. On the other side, many whites, especially non-college educated whites, have been drawn to the Republican Party and its anti-immigrant and anti-minority appeals, motivated in part by anxiety, fears, and resentments that millions of overwhelmingly non-white newcomers will undermine the basic identity of the nation and disadvantage and marginalize whites. In the context of these racial fears and resentments, immigration has emerged as a major focus of political debates and campaigns, another change in the realm of politics. Overt anti-immigrant rhetoric became a staple of the strategies of many Republican leaders, most obviously Donald Trump, who gave it a legitimacy in political discourse at the highest levels as he sought to mobilize his core constituency. Who can forget shithole countries, chants of build the wall, and the Chinese virus. In a kind of feedback loop, Trump's core supporters' enthusiastic response to his anti-immigrant discourse led to a further emphasis on it as a way to energize his following. Trump, as some historians say, was the most anti-immigrant president in all American history. But since he's left office, anti-immigrant politics remains alive and well in the Republican Party. A number of elected Republican politicians and right-wing media personalities, Tucker Carlson among them, or maybe most prominently Tucker Carlson, have capitalized and intensified white resentments, promoting the view that native-born white Americans are deliberately being replaced by immigrants, and pro-immigrant Democratic policies in order to reduce whites' political power. On the whole, however, immigration has brought enormous benefits as it has created far-reaching changes, something evident when we look at cities and towns around the country. Immigrants, by their sheer numbers, have provided a lifeline in many cities that were losing population. They've played a key role in the growth of places like Las Vegas and Orlando that were becoming major metropolitan areas for the first time. And they've revitalized many far-flung rural communities, slowing population loss, and in some cases, even enabling the population to grow. In many central cities, immigration helped deteriorating neighborhoods make a comeback. In New York, for example, Brighton Beach is one area, Sunset Park. There's been much written about in Chicago, Little Village, neighborhoods that really had fallen on hard times and where immigrants really revitalized and revived them. They've helped spur population growth and economic growth. And immigration was a factor behind the decline in violent crime in urban America from the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. When it comes to the economy, immigration has fostered innovation, fueled growth, and helped to shape the development of whole industries. Immigrants practically invented Silicon Valley. They've had an outsized role in high tech, now one of the nation's national economy's largest components, starting and running major new companies and spearheading innovations in them. Think, for example, of Google's Russian-born co-founder, Sergey Brin, or eBay's founder, Pierre Omidyar, who was born in France to Iranian migrant parents, and there are many others. In 2018, over half of the 91 startup companies valued at $1 billion or more had at least one immigrant founder. More than 80% of these companies employed immigrants in key management or product development roles, commonly as chief technology officers and vice presidents of engineering. And the group that's very highly associated with, although not the only one, are Indians, many of whom came initially on H-1B visas and then stayed. Immigrants have spurred the formation of other businesses as well, giving many a new character, pioneering new types of enterprises, from nail salons to Asian American supermarket chains. And in New York City, just to mention one, West Indian dollar vans that ply the streets of Brooklyn and Queens, offering cheaper and more convenient services than city buses, and the Chinatown buses, also emanating from New York City, which initially took people to the Northeast, but now looking at workers going to their jobs, now are also take people further, and many non-Chinese. Nationwide, 1 in 5 business owners in 2014 were immigrants, and they founded about a quarter of new firms. Immigrants have helped any number of service industries grow and flourish, filling essential roles at every occupational level, from picking crops to repairing houses, and obviously, and of course, during the pandemic, filling essential frontline service jobs, from, delivering our Amazon packages, right, to working as clerks in supermarkets and drugstores, and working in caregiving jobs in all kinds of, in nursing homes and in many jobs in hospitals. They've reduced shortages in medical and healthcare professions. 28% of the nation's physicians and surgeons are immigrants. 16% of the registered nurses in the US are immigrants. They fill jobs and driven up demand in a number of low-wage occupations, including childcare and elder care, because the millions of immigrants themselves use services and consume goods. They've boosted the economy and job growth, including in an array of public service jobs. I always like to say that without immigrants, the schools may be overcrowded, right, in New York and other heavily immigrant cities, but without immigrants, there would be closing, schools would be closing, and there would be fewer jobs. Now that leads to another issue. Have immigrants hurt Native workers? Overall, not much, because immigrants increase demand for goods and services, and also because immigrants, small firms, and startups often generate opportunities for native-born workers, and because highly educated immigrants boost local productivity. The overwhelming consensus among economists is that immigration's adverse effects on US-born workers' wages and employment have, taken as a whole overall, have been minimal. Lastly, immigrants are invigorating and indeed making what we think of as our uniquely American culture. The foods we eat, the music we listen to, the films we watch, and the books we read. A topic that has really gotten short shrift, I would say, in the immigration literature, and an area where immigrants have had a huge impact on American society and culture. If earlier Jewish and Italian immigrants brought us bagels and pizza, salsa now outsells ketchup, tacos are standard fare. In 2015, Chinese restaurants in the US outnumbered all the Burger Kings, Kentucky Fried Chickens, and McDonald's combined, and they now include a broad range of regional dishes and flavors. Whether dining at a high-end restaurant, getting a bite at a fast food chain, or buying groceries in the supermarket, immigration has added new tastes to our cuisine. Immigrants and the second generation are new authors on bestseller lists. You only have to look practically every single week at the New York Times Book Review to see a novel or a memoir by an immigrant or second generation authors. Among them are well known and lauded are Junot Diaz and Junko Lahiri, both of them Pulitzer Prize winners for respectively The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde and The Namesake. Not only do immigrant and second generation writers highlight perennial immigrant themes such as adjusting to life in American society and culture, but also contemporary issues such as undocumented status. The same goes for films and TV programs with immigrant and second generation stars, writers, and producers. And yes, they are still underrepresented in TVs and movies, but they are making their presence felt. Two examples, the award-winning TV series, comedy series Ugly Betty, which went on for many seasons and won many awards with its Latino producer and cast and star who was the child of Honduran immigrants, and the film The Big Sick, which I particularly like, I have to say, a romantic comedy focusing on South Asian arranged marriage, or really semi-arranged marriage, with a Pakistani-born star and co-writer, Kumail Nanjiani. Immigrants and the second generation have taken popular music in new directions. Pop music stars with roots in Latin America have brought Latin rhythms fused with American popular music to mainstream audience, one of the best known being Miami-based and Cuban-born Gloria Estefan. Caribbean immigrants have introduced the sounds of Jamaican reggae, Dominican merengue, and Cuban salsa, and they have played a major role in the creation and development of hip hop. Among the recent rap celebrities are Nicki Minaj, born in Trinidad, and Rihanna from Barbados. In fact, there was a big story the other day about Rihanna, right? And she's pregnant and pictures of her, right? She's a superstar. At one and the same time, immigrants and the US born second generation have broadened mainstream American culture while also creating new mixtures that blend aspects of American and immigrant cultures. So immigration, to conclude, has profoundly changed America. I've only really skimmed the surface. The book has much more detail and also much more complexity about the changes. And I also have said nothing, which I do a lot in the book, in relating this to the past and looking at changes that immigrants brought in earlier eras and how they differ from or build on what is happening today. And looking ahead, there are more changes clearly in store in the future as millions of the US born second generation grow up and enter adulthood, and as also new immigrants continue to enter the country. The meaning of racial and ethnic categories, to mention one example, is likely to change as more children and grandchildren of post-65 immigrants move into the upper ends of the occupational hierarchy, and the proportion of mixed marriages and multiracial children grows. And we'll see changes in other spheres too, linked to immigration, including in the world of politics, as racial minorities become a larger part of the electorate. Immigration, in short, has been, and no doubt will continue to be a major element in the evolution of American society and culture. And actually, in some ways, I mean, that's in some ways the message of the book, I guess. I mean, immigration has always been a part of American society, always has led to changes and its evolution over time. And it's been doing that again in the last 50 years in ways that have yet to be fully explored. Our growth as a nation, the historian Oscar Hanlon wrote more than 60 years ago, has been achieved in large measure through the genius and industry of immigrants of every race and from every quarter of the world. Their brains and their brawn help to build our industries, to develop our commerce, to produce new inventions, and in general, to make us the nation that we now are. The millions of immigrants who have arrived since Hanlon wrote these words have driven additional and fundamental changes. If there is a final lesson to be learned, it's that understanding these transformations is and should be a key part of our analysis of immigration's enormous impact as served as a building block of the nation and is bound in the years ahead continue to mold and remold our society in new and sometimes unexpected ways. So thank you very much, and I await all the comments.
Filiz, may we invite you to speak?
Yes. Thank you, Van, and thank you, Dakota, for helping organize this wonderful workshop. I feel so lucky to have this in my hands, such a beautiful book. And I love the cover. My kids love the cover. It's not always that they pick up an academic book and look at it. So I really, really feel lucky to have read this book before most people. And as a scholar of immigration, but also as an immigrant, I realized how much I didn't know about the transformative force that is immigration in America. There are so many things that we take for granted now. I think if you didn't look at it historically, it's very easy to think that today's immigration is somewhat different from the past. And it's very easy to buy into that rhetoric of some things are different today. And I really appreciated seeing the full picture. I also appreciated seeing the transformations in different domains of life, from the racial order, from the neighborhoods, from the economy, to the political alignments, the culture. So I think nothing up to this date, nothing I've read until now has given me such a broad picture. So Nancy, thank you so much for writing this book as a scholar and as an immigrant. I'm really, really thankful. This is something that I want my kids to read and understand, because when Trump was elected, I immediately panicked that I gave my kids Turkish names and what would their future be. And this book gives me a lot of optimism that things will be fine. Even politics will be fine in the long run. So one of the things that I really, really appreciated, and I don't think we have much of, is to look at immigrants not just as workers, but as consumers. And I think, again, we tend to have this very Malthusian view when it comes to immigration. Most people think that we have this big pie, and then with more people, we need to kind of cut thinner and thinner slices. But in the book, we see that immigrants produce, they consume, they pay taxes, they buy houses that would otherwise be abandoned, they keep the schools open, and they give so much to the community. And their presence helps wherever they end up. So again, it just came out in every chapter, and it was really, really helpful. And again, the historical outlook for me was really what made me kind of put things in perspective and made it okay to be optimistic, realistically optimistic about the future. So many things that I've learned in this book. So I'll just kind of very briefly summarize what really stood out to me. And I thought I knew quite a bit about immigration, American immigration, but apparently not. So the spread of immigrants to suburbia is a huge development. And I think in the past, when immigrants and minorities came into different neighborhoods, maybe white flight was a common pattern. And if we left it to the white flight, maybe those communities would have deteriorated completely, but immigrants came in and revitalized those neighborhoods. But they also made not just the cities that they usually come to, but also suburbs, all kinds of places, even rural areas, more diverse. So nowadays, although we see this diversification, we're not seeing as much of a white flight because every neighborhood almost in America is more diverse than it used to be. So this is a huge development. And again, it's like the revitalization that the immigrants bring to these communities, to the housing market, is really remarkable to follow up. So my husband's family, half of his family is in England, and his great-grandmother was very skeptical of immigrants until she realized that her post office is remaining open because there are immigrants. So these are really, really important changes for everyone to realize how much their life, their own experience depends on the presence of immigrants. And also kind of, I think when we look at the economic impact, we don't realize that much, how much certain industries are only viable. They only exist in this country because there's immigrant labor. And you talk about the garment industry, you talk about, meat packing, you talk about agribusiness. And when we look at the aggregate impact of immigrants, like the National Academies report, maybe we don't see these more nuanced understandings of how certain lines of work are here because of immigrants. Also, immigrants make many services that I use daily, like childcare, affordable to many of us. We don't have much of childcare benefits in this country. Similarly, domestic work, similarly, various beauty services, nail salons being a big example, have only become available to us because there are immigrants. And now they're acceptable, they've become normative, so they've changed what's expected of a middle-class life in a way. And again, it's very easy to ignore this. One side question I had was how the pandemic actually affected this, because we're doing a study with immigrants in the Bronx, in New York City, and all the domestic workers reported they lost their jobs. And I also worry about this hybrid work arrangements, remote working. What's going to happen to our caretakers and domestic workers? Many of them are immigrants. So the stability of their work has certainly been impacted. So I would love to pick your brain a little bit on that. So also the discussion of the racial line, how Jewish and Italian immigrants were white from the perspective of their skin color, but they were not white enough in other respects, and how the color line that we have is, again, a very social construct that depends on the time, was really, really illuminating. Another interesting point was the transformation of Asian Americans from being seen as a potentially problematic group to becoming a model minority. And one of the mechanisms that you talk about in the book is how Americans started looking outwards and started realizing that the countries these immigrants come from, like South Korea, China, are fast developing, so they've come to admire these places. But I also wonder about more insular nature of the first America First rhetoric, in addition to anti-immigrant sentiment, if those will go hand in hand to maybe reverse some of these developments, that we stop looking outward, we become so insular that these things feed off of each other. But overall, I found a lot of reason for optimism in the book, even when it comes to electoral politics, where we learn how the political alignments have changed in the US over time. This wasn't something I knew much about, but seeing that change is the only constant really gave me a lot of optimism, even though more and more Hispanics are voting for the Republican Party, even though whites are voting more for the Republican Party. I think we still have room for hope, especially given that more immigrants will make up the electoral base. And also there's a cohort shift that young Americans of all stripes are more likely to have liberal views toward immigrants. So again, I would love to hear your thoughts on the future that you envision, maybe politically. So as a side, there's room for optimism, but one group seems to be excluded from that, and that is Black immigrants. And again, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. One of the arguments in the book is Black immigrants in the first generation, and this is something we know from Mary's work as well, in the first generation can choose to identify with their national origins. So you can say, I'm Haitian American. And so basically, you're not seen as a monolithic group, part of the African Americans in this country who are disadvantaged. But with the second generation, those cues that suggest your national origins, your accent, maybe some of your customs are lost. So the second generation, you mentioned in the book, maybe will not have that option of identifying with their national origins. And then a good share of Black immigrants are actually from sub-Saharan Africa, they're Muslim, so they have this additional disadvantage of having a different religion. So maybe the boundaries will be bright for them. So again, do we have room for optimism there as well? Or are there things that would make their experience different going into the future? And then finally, this is a small thing, but I really appreciated it. So there are many examples of immigrants as innovators. And at some point in the book, you ask, why are immigrants so good at innovating? And it all comes down to basically having to relearn everything. It all comes down to what immigrant experience is like. You come to a new country, you have to relearn everything from how to talk to how to approach people to how to smile. a new language, all of these things. And, you basically have to keep an open mind. And I wonder, with increasing diversity, if this logic should apply to all of us as we are exposed to more and more different people. Maybe, again, that's kind of room for optimism. I certainly hope so. I certainly hope that we can keep our minds and hearts open to make new immigrants feel as welcome as we can. So thank you so much again for this wonderful book. I really, really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you, Filiz. I always learn so much listening to you, and to your point about the future. Is it going to be more diverse and equal, or more diverse yet remaining unequal? So footnote for you, Nancy. Now to our very, very own, my undergrad advisor, Professor Phil Kasinitz.
Okay. Thank you very much, Van. And thank you, Dakota, for organizing this. And thank you, for Nancy, for writing the book. I guess the first thing I should say, in the interest of full disclosure, is that Nancy Foner and I have been colleagues for decades, friends decades longer than that, occasional collaborators and co-editors. So anyone who is interested in the blood sport aspects of the author-critic session is liable to be disappointed with my comments. But this is a very good book, and I would think it's a good book even if it hadn't been written by my friend. It's an excellent overview of what we know about contemporary immigration. It's wonderfully well written, and I think that's something to emphasize. This is a book that I really hope gets picked up by general audiences. I mean, because while it covers a lot of territory, it does so in a really very, very approachable way. At the same time, it doesn't scrimp on the complexity, because these are complicated issues. And while Filiz is absolutely right that it's an optimistic book, it's not a Pollyanna-ish book. It's willing to say that, as in any demographic or social shift of this size, there are winners and losers. There's some things that aren't working as well. It's not a purely just aren't immigrants great kind of trumpeting of the success, but it's, I think, a quite reasoned, on balance argument that the resumption of large-scale international migration in the 1960s has, by and large, made the United States a better, fairer, and more prosperous place. And on balance, this is something that we need to celebrate. So it's a very timely book, partially because after several decades of social science about immigrants, the roles they fill, their economic situations, their political attitudes, their incorporation or their non-incorporation into US society, it's a book that sort of turns the telescope onto the other end and says, okay, so what happened to that society? And that, it's not the first book to do this. I'm thinking Thomas Jimenez's work on Silicon Valley. In Europe, the BAM project by Maurice Krull and Franz Lely are all sort of, that's a plug, by the way, because we're doing a conference on that in a couple of weeks, just so you know. But in some sense, it, more than almost anything that's currently been written, takes a broad historical view and puts the question of what does immigration mean for American society in historical view. And it really emphasizes how big the changes have been. There is a tendency, particularly in the ethnic studies world and to some degree in the world of whiteness studies, much of which is written by historians, to emphasize the historian's fascination with the origins of things, right? So we learn a lot about, from ethnic studies, Asian American communities in the 19th century, or early communities of people we would today call Latinx in the Southwest. And all of that's important in terms of identity, all of that's important in terms of origin, but it's also important to remember that the numbers really were much, much smaller, right? And the context, the thing, we do have that kind of historian bias of saying, okay, here's an origin point. But I think that this book puts it in a much broader, more social scientific frame in thinking about how things really did change since the 1960s and putting the new immigration in the context of the many changes that shifted American life in the 1960s. I always think we have a kind of, those of you who know bad television from about 40 years ago will recognize the reference, but there's kind of a Happy Days complex in a lot of American historical life of seeing the 1950s as normal, right? And why are the 50s normal? Because they happened before the 60s. So it's like, you know, go back to before that stuff happened, and that's back when stuff was real. But of course, on this issue, as in many other issues, the 50s were a really unusual time. And they were unusual because they were the low point historically of foreign-born populations in the United States. So while the new immigration since the 1960s has changed American society, it's in some ways a kind of a back to the future moment, because it is, and this is where I think the Foner book is really quite good, in emphasizing both what's different, because things really are different, and also what's continuous with what had happened in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. I would also just point out that I think that, to put it this way, a lot of the scholarship on immigration, this is something I think Filiz was alluding to, tends to be divided to an extent between those who tend to see the post-1960s migration as completely and utterly new, largely for reasons of racial difference, but also changes in the economy, changes in the world trade, changes in technology that allow much faster movement of goods and services and people, and really see that that is an utterly new situation that doesn't really have, that previous immigrations don't have much to teach us about. And then there's another group, almost over all New Yorkers, interestingly, who tend to say that while those changes are important, there are also very real continuities with the way migration happened in the pre-1920s era. And I think Foner is, you know, clearly a representative of that, that latter trend. Of course, there are some things that changed between the in terms of immigrant incorporation and transitions, and two of the most important things that happened between the 1920s and the 1960s, well, one of them, you know, in terms of the fact that previous waves of immigrants were incorporated, is the fact that that happened. You know, that the world of the 1960s was different because Southern and Eastern Europeans and other minorities had been incorporated more or less successfully. It took longer than we normally remember. It was more difficult than we sometimes remember, but by the 60s that had occurred. And the idea of what is American society was broader, and the capability of it to become broader was something that people understood, that American popular culture was broader than it had been in the Anglo-conformity world of, let's say, the last decades of the 19th century. Of course, the other important thing that happened, and this is also in the book, although sometimes in the background, is the African-American-led civil rights movement. You know, it's almost impossible to conceive of the upward mobility that Nancy mentioned of Asian Americans, you know, in the post-1960s period, you know, without the changes in the idea of race and what race means that were created by the African-American civil rights movement. There is a huge debate about what causes and what are the limits of Asian American upward mobility. Where are the bamboo ceilings, as Margaret Shin has called them, the places that you don't get to enter, how much mobility there really has been, to what extent that mobility is limited, why a higher education is so much more than, let's say, in other areas of life, you know, to what extent is this the result of selective migration, to what extent is it the result of culture. Foner actually mentions all these debates without actually coming down on one side or another with them, which is interesting. But what's really fascinating is that none of that would matter a whit if American racial attitudes were what they were in 1940, you know? And so the importance of the civil rights movement, and I don't think this is something that people always give adequate credit for. Okay. I would like to just quickly now mention that this brings us, and Nancy talked about this at some length, so I really don't have to, but it does bring us to the interesting question of race and the importance of race. When Handlin used the term race and talking about different races, he was using it in the old-fashioned way of meaning nation. You know, he wasn't using it in the way of talking, the way Whoopi Goldberg used it recently and got in trouble for, as seeing it purely having to do with skin color. The meaning of the term race has shifted, and it makes it difficult sometimes to make easy, you know, when the Irish became white, or like use racialized language today, referring to the 19th or early 20th century. So this is, I think, a complexity that is under, that lies underneath a lot of that. Nevertheless, the question really is, and again, back to America, what do we choose to see as race? Our friend Ruben Rumbaut likes to talk about race as a pigment of the imagination. And in that sense, what do we focus on? What do we make of race? What have we decided is race? And again, Whoopi Goldberg can get in trouble for assuming that the way race is thought of in the United States today, without recognizing that an equally racial way of thinking of things was going on in Germany in the middle of the 20th century, but that viewed different people differently. Just quickly, I want to point out some other great things about this book. I think the attention here, she draws a lot on Richard Alba, is the importance of mixed race people and the growing importance of racial mixture in the United States and what that's going to mean in the future. I love the chapter on places. You know, diversity is increasingly seen as a characteristic of places, not just individuals, you know. And what is it that draws some people to cosmopolitan places? What is it that repels some people? And of course, the fact that one migration leads to others, because some people specifically leave places that are becoming more diverse and seek out places that are becoming more monocultural. So in some sense, the great sort that we talk a lot about politically in the United States, and that interacts so bizarrely and unfortunately with a lot of American constitutional questions, very often overlaps with this whole question of who's attracted to increasingly diverse urban areas and who's repelled by them, and what that is starting to mean. I also want to congratulate Nancy on the chapter on culture. It's a tremendous addition. I would say the discussion of the assimilation and evolution of the bagel on page 101 is worth the price of admission. As she goes over how the cement donuts of my youth, the Eastern European ghetto product, got larger and larger, but also softer, squishier, more flat. I mean, it's a perfect metaphor for Americanization. But in all seriousness, culture is also important because very often that's where difference is really experienced. And if you actually pay attention to some of the replacement theories or the kind of immigration panics of the Chicken Little right, very often it is based on cultural discomfort. You know, people often feel the need to express that in economic terms because it's kind of rational and it seems like an adult thing. And so are people taking jobs, or what is demography? What's the fiscal impacts? But if you push it only a little bit, you suddenly start to get into who's comfortable with being in a world of multiple languages, of new and different tastes, of new and different sounds, and who's uncomfortable with that. And my suspicion is that this is one of those cases where the cosmopolitan worldview will win, but it's going to take a while, and it's not going to be easy, and it doesn't happen all the time. Finally, I want to underline something that Filiz said, which is really the role that immigration has played in creating better lives for middle-class American consumers. And this is something that out of embarrassment, we don't talk about a huge amount. And very often it's easy to trivialize, you know, you just want, got into an interesting conversation with a reporter on this recently where he was talking about, well, you know, sure, immigration leads to cheap childcare and good restaurants, but is that a good reason to, well, you know, high quality childcare in a country that doesn't have the government providing it is really important thing. And by the way, I'm in favor of good restaurants. And, you know, I mean, we shouldn't feel ashamed of saying that there are some benefits there. That doesn't necessarily mean we ignore the fact that either immigrant workers or displaced native workers might be negatively impacted by that. And so when you have something that is good for the society as a whole, but bad for some members, I hate to say it, oh good, there's very few economists here as I look around, so I can't say it. The answer here is redistribution, you know, not changing the basically valuable situation. So we have a relationship here with the past. It's not timeless replays, as Professor Foner puts it, but a present that echoes the past. Maybe history that doesn't repeat itself, but occasionally rhymes. And wonderfully explains how we as a nation are changing because we are a quarter immigrant. Now, I do have one criticism that I have to bring up, but it's a warning to Professor Foner. According to yesterday's New York Times, the number of immigrants in the population is now 14%, with big growth in the elderly immigrant population, as well as the biggest growth in the 45 to 65 age group. So aging immigrants are going to be a really important issue in the coming decades. But also with 14% plus whatever percent that means with kids, we're now well over a quarter of the nation. And by the time the second edition comes out, you're going to have to rethink, maybe it'll be close to a third of the nation. So I want you to start thinking about that, and your publisher is going to have to probably change the cover for that reason. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Once again, Phil can go on for a long time, and everything is worth listening to. Last but not least, Professor Mary C. Waters, who's my own grad advisor. I always feel it's unfair that Mary always goes last, and sometimes we have to do this in reverse alphabetical order for a change. But Mary, may we invite you?
Thank you, Van, and thank you, Dakota, for helping to organize this, and thank you to Nancy for this wonderful book. And yes, my husband's last name is Bailey, as some of you know, and I really did consider actually changing my name so that I could be at the front of the alphabet, but decided it probably wasn't worth it. But the kids have his name, so they're at the front. Anyway, a number of points that I plan to make have been made by my co-panelists, so I'll try to be brief. I too love this book. It is really masterful, and Nancy is one of these scholars who reads widely across the social sciences, across literature. She's just able to then synthesize what she has learned and what all of these different scholars have done in a way that opens new avenues for thought, and that really brings things together. And she makes it look easy because she writes so beautifully and she writes so many books. She is a bit of a rate buster for the rest of us, but she makes it look easy, but it is anything but easy. And so I just really want to congratulate her on just the scope of this book. And it's really taking on also a very difficult question, which is not how are we changing them, or how are immigrants changing, or how is anything very specific changing, but kind of, asking the fish to describe how the water around them is changing. And that's a very, very difficult thing to do. And she really pulls it off in, the areas that Phil and Filiz and Nancy herself have described. And I won't go into my own ode to the bagel, but I do recommend the description of bagels and other food in the culture chapter, which I loved. I think this is a very optimistic story, and you've got three panelists who basically agree with Nancy in telling, in our own scholarship, some positive aspects of immigration. Of course, there are a lot of negative aspects of it too. And especially when you get down to the lives of people that are very, very hard. That immigration is hard and people lose a lot by immigrating. And so the positive gains for America, in part, are also positive gains for the immigrants, but we also recognize in our work how much they sacrifice, especially how much they sacrifice to get to the US to make a better life for themselves, and how much they lose and how hard their lives are. I wonder, and it's hard in our current political environment to be empathetic or sympathetic to people who don't agree with you politically. But as we think about kind of the transformation of the US, I think it's also hard for native-born whites and some African Americans also to absorb immigrants and to see their own place and to see their own culture and their neighborhoods transformed. I think many of us, and we were just alluding to it, our lives are made easier by immigration. Many of us are upper middle class or upper class, and we can purchase things from immigrants, and immigrants' lives enliven our culture and our food, et cetera. But I do think that across Europe and in the United States, you do find, especially people who are working class, lower middle class, or poor, who see immigrants moving forward and face a loss and are interpreting the gains of immigration as a loss for themselves. And of course, this has been tapped into in a very horrible way in our politics right now. And so I think one big question as we think about how immigration is transforming us, which Nancy struggles with, and I don't think we know the answer, is, is this current nasty politics that Trump rode to the presidency on, and is the current backlash against immigrants a bump in the road, or is it a fork in the road? Is it something that we're going to overcome as we accept new immigrants, or is it something that is going to define our politics going forward and is going to lead to less democracy, right? To disenfranchising more and more people, to those who think they're losing something, taking control to stop the change that they see that they don't like. And that's for another book, I think, but I think that Nancy's scholarship across all of these different areas really summarizes, and especially, she ends the last chapter, I think, before the conclusion, is the electoral politics. And it really raises a lot of questions for us, like who sees immigration as a zero-sum game as opposed to a enlargement of the pie? How do our class politics map onto our perception of immigrants and our racial politics? And I think these are very complex questions that are raised in the book, and that we will need to struggle with as scholars going forward. So I don't really have criticisms of the book, or and my friends have, or Filiz and Phil have already said a lot of the things I wanted to say in praise of the book. So what I wanted to do kind of at the now is to think about all good books launch new projects because they make you think differently about the world after you read them. And so Nancy's book, I think, should launch a lot of scholars, some of whom probably are here, and who can take up kind of the questions that come from our understanding of how immigration has transformed America that Nancy brings. So one real question is Nancy has really talked a lot about what stays the same and what changes, and where there is this historical continuity in terms of how we've dealt with immigration and how it has changed. And I think you can read a lot of the debates in sociology right now as being about kind of accentuating the continuity or accentuating the differences, especially owing to race. But I think what we really need to understand better are some of the mechanisms of these changes. So what are the mechanisms that lead to greater acceptance of immigrants? Are they institutionally based? Are they psychologically based? What are the ways in which people's thinking about diversity, people's actions, are there legal things that can happen, policy things that can happen to make us make this transition into a more diverse world? And I think this requires social scientists to really be out there measuring what's working and what's not working in terms of these great changes. The chapter on culture really raises this great question, which Phil and Filiz also talked about, which is what makes immigrants in the second generation such a source of creativity and a driver of innovation. And I think, we need more studies of this and more analyses of and also the question of whether or not diversity itself and interacting with people who have come from different cultures also creates innovation and innovation among the native born. So I think a big question is about sort of class differences and whether immigration is going to lead to a change in social class going forward. If you read The Economist, Raj Chetty and his collaborators looking at kind of the American dream and social mobility in the US, you see that we never had as much social mobility as the American dream ideology told us, but really some of the only people who are experiencing the real social mobility of the American dream are immigrants. And so one question is kind of, is that something that's going to reinvigorate a kind of what Vivian Louis calls the immigrant bargain? Is it going to reinvigorate that and give more support to an idea of an American dream, or is it going to once again be something that's going to make people jealous or negatively predisposed towards immigrants because they are having a greater experience of social mobility? And then I guess I would return to the question of the fish and the sea. So Nancy Foner's book is just so good, and it really, I think it builds on her history of scholarship, where she has looked so carefully at our history to understand immigration, and also looked comparatively with Europe. And the last chapter really brings us back to that. And I think those are the two frames that we need to really understand how America is changing. But then I guess the next question that many of you will have to take on, some younger scholars, what is it that we don't yet see? And I'm sure there's a lot, right? What is it that is changing in the United States for better or for worse because of the changes that have come from this great migration? And how do we even identify them? How do we measure them? And I think Nancy's given younger scholars a lens to do that, both through kind of comparative studies and comparative historical studies, that will lead us kind of to see new facts and new themes that that she hasn't yet discovered, but that build on this really important book. So thank you, Nancy, for writing it and for sending me a copy. I was very excited about that.
Thank you so much, Mary. You gave us so many new ideas now, and hopefully the doctoral students would write those dissertations you just described. Nancy, I would like to give you maybe 3 or 5 minutes to briefly respond, because I know lots of people in the audience have questions for you. Please.
Well, first of all, let me just thank you, Phil, Filiz, and Mary for all those wonderful comments, and obviously, and raising so many questions. And of course, I love the fact that you like the book, of course. That's always nice, right, as an author, always nice to hear, but also for raising all these really, really good, making, comments and questions, and making me see things that I wrote about in a somewhat different way and thinking more about them. So I really, really appreciated it. It's funny to hear some, I have specific comments that I, in terms of when I think about, some of the issues that I grappled with in writing the book were, it was, what's one issue was, well, what's new today? I guess people have raised that, what you're looking at change, but so how much is this really just a repeat of the past, and how much is really new? And obviously, this gets into, how much is similar. And actually, when I think of people writing about the similarities of the past, I think of historians, actually, because they kind of always want to say, when sociologists write about things, they always want to say, well, but no, this happened before, there's nothing new here. Whereas actually the sociologists writing about immigration on the whole tend to emphasize newness, and that things are different, and they really don't pay much attention to the past on the whole. But I think that, there's both going on. I mean, that's what I tried to do in the book, was to show that there are similarities with the past, but the past is not repeating itself the same way. And so even things like, the ethnic succession in politics, right, where, new politicians come into the same roles, and it seems like they're just, different people in the same place, moving into similar roles. But as they do that in the present, they change them. I mean, they introduce changes. So, and that's, the small changes, and there obviously are some big ones. So I did grapple with that. Another thing that I grappled with, and that sort of came up in some of the conversations because people were adding, is that although I emphasized throughout the book the really critical role of immigration in change in American society, both in the past and in the present, it doesn't operate on its own. I mean, I did want to bring that up, and I do that in the analyses of the specific issues, and then at the end I come back to it, that there's multiple factors involved if we're looking at change in American society. Obviously, that's obviously true. Immigration has an outsized role in many ways and is very important, but we also have to consider other factors. I guess Bill was talking a lot about the civil rights movement and civil rights legislation. I mean, just to come back to this issue of politics, right, where I talk about the change in, the changes in political partisanship, right, in the U.S. But we can't leave out, obviously, a key factor was the civil rights movement and legislation, which made the South the solid Democratic South disappeared. Well, it's maybe some of it is coming a little bit, but and the whites became Republican. I mean, that's huge. It's not just that's one of the factors. There were other movements. There was a reaction, obviously, economic factors, that are involved in resentments among whites, in non-college educated whites. It's not just over immigration. So I just wanted to make that, you have to read the book, right? I don't want to go into every issue. And the same, I guess, what I was thinking of, Filiz was emphasizing with the issue of, why Asian Americans have gone from this, yellow peril, East Asians really, this common notion. And then now many think of them as a model minority. And, one factor that I throw out is this issue of now, Asian countries are these super economic powers, but obviously it's there are other factors, the hyper selection among Asian Americans, the fact that many of them are doing, they're disproportionately represented in elite institutions. I mean, there's been a number of factors that have led to changes in attitudes. I just wanted to just throw that out. But I'm really, my pessimism, it's interesting, people say I'm so optimistic. And I guess in some ways it is, many ways I am optimistic, and but I did grapple with the political. I thought that was, I don't feel that optimistic. I don't think there are causes, there are possibilities for some optimism about politics and immigration, that there'll be a larger percentage of minorities, that the Republicans will feel that they have to reach out more to minorities, right? So that they will, maybe they'll tone down some of their anti-immigrant and anti-minority messages, in order to get more of that vote. On the other hand, hello, I mean, you only have to read, right? I mean, there's voters, we don't know, we've seen, for example, in the last election that Trump, got 10% more of the Hispanic vote. The question is, will he, there are factors in the Latino community that may move more of them. And as more Latinos and Asians become successful, they may become more conservative as they, in the process. We have a structure of our political system helps the Republicans, right? With the senatorial and, every state having 2 senators, and the way the Electoral College works, and voter suppression, and non-college educated whites who are very heavily favored right-wing Republicans they're going to be a significant proportion of the electorate for a while to come. And then there's also turnout rates. So, I mean, it's, there are many, I don't think, I'm not that optimistic. I don't, if we, in terms of politics, in terms of how much immigration will lead to, the Democratic, help the Democrats. I mean, there was that book, a number of years ago. Everyone's always predicting that, the growth in minorities is going to be good for the Democrats. And then we get Donald Trump, right? And who knows what will happen. So but what I tend to, maybe it's somewhat of a cop out, I deal with the different factors, because we can never truly predict what's going to happen, right? So you just have to analyze the different factors that are at work. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out, and maybe I should now. I hope that you'll look at the book, obviously. And I do think, just maybe to end on a note that others have said, that I think it is really important to understand American society, that we need to understand, obviously, immigration, and that when you have 1/4 of the country in the present being immigrants or children of immigrants, they have a huge impact on every domain. I mean, they do, and that we need to study that and know more about it and what its impact is. I think that should be a key part of what sociology and social scientists do. Okay, so on that note, I can open it. I'm sorry that I took more time, but to open it up for questions. Whether.
Thank you so much, Nancy.
Chowder, you want to
appreciate it. Before I turn it back to the code, I just want to add one final footnote, and that is to underscore what Mary said about how difficult some of these immigrants are struggling in the new lives that they have here. And in particular, many of these jobs, actually very bad jobs with, no benefits and low pay, from domestic work to agricultural work, with no unionization. Ruth Miltman, our colleagues, have written about this in her new book, which, by the way, is going to be the seminar on April 11th. So I encourage you to come and hear about it. The title of the book is Immigrant Labor and the New Precariat, an excellent argument for that topic. So Dakota, I'm turning it back to you. Thank
you. Sorry, there's a very loud dishwasher behind me, I just realized. But I'm turning it to Maurice Cruel. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. Thank you, Nancy, for the lovely talk and all the comments. You would not be surprised that I would ask a question about the non-Hispanic whites and how they are changing in their attitudes and maybe also their practices in relation to this big change, this big demographic change. I mean, from a European perspective, the biggest political change in the last 5-10 years has been Trump and Trump politics, and how that has been really also getting at the heart of the democratic system in the US. So there is something going on among the non-Hispanic white group that has led to this process. And so how would you connect that with the change, or do you connect that with this change?
You want me to? Well, should I just, who's Dakota? Should I go? Do you want to have a bunch of questions, or I should? Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and answer?
Oh, okay. I'm not exactly clear what you're
saying. Cannot hear you, Nancy.
Oh, I'm not muted. Are you?
Now you're there.
I'm there. I'm there. I'm not 100% clear at what you're getting at. Because I thought that how does immigration affect the leading the section? It's a segment of the white population. First of all, it's not all whites who are being, it's in the United States, it's really, non-college educated whites, conservatives, evangelical Protestants. Those are the groups that are feeling disadvantaged. They feel that immigrants are cutting in line, to use Arlie Hochschild's, phrase, that they're getting preferential treatment, and they're experiencing economic, the globalization, the decline of union jobs, and the resentments are coming out in many cases, well, to Native minorities, but also to immigrants. So, I mean, that's it's I think that is one of the ways that immigration has had an effect on whites, in addition to making them, as I said, more, and many whites more aware of their racial position and feeling disadvantaged as a result. And in fact, it's interesting, if you read recently, I guess I was reading something today about this, that the Republicans are planning to build on this, actually, that, that racism against whites is what they're calling it, right? And that's, it's, yeah, that which is kind of amazing, right? But they're trying to build on that, yeah. So that's how it's working. Yeah, I don't know if that's what you were getting at, or there are other issues that you were getting at, Maurice.
No, that's really what I want to ask, and but also really getting at the mechanism behind that, I think, because your summary was about all the sort of positive effects on communities, on schools, on culture, and apparently there's a big group that is saying this is apparently not for me the main things that I am interested in. There's other things that I'm seen to lose, and they are more important than all these benefits.
Well, I guess the answer is that we need more studies like yours that are going to look at the in the US, we would say the non-Hispanic white population, and to see how they perceive and how they feel affected by immigration. And I think in the US also, I think Mary was the one who raised this. It's not just non-Hispanic whites. I mean, another, given the racial makeup of the US, what about non-Hispanic Blacks? I mean, they're a large group in the United States. How are they reacting to immigration? How are they? I think there was a very, very interesting Orly Clerk's book on, she looked at these suburban areas in New York. And one of the interesting things is that it was these suburban communities had Haitian, Jamaican, and African Americans. And interestingly, the African Americans started thinking of themselves more as Southern white, whites from the South. and sort of the original Blacks, you know, that they were here. I mean, they were differentiating themselves. So they felt affected. We tend not to look at that, you know, everything focuses on, well, it's the same thing would be actually with native-born you know, long-term Hispanics who've been living here for a long time. Puerto Ricans in New York, but in the South and in the Southwest, it's Chicanos, you know, who've been here for 100 days. What about them? I mean, actually, Thomas Jimenez writes about that in the book that he wrote, you know, his first book on replenished ethnicity. But I mean, I think that raises some of those other issues too, is how, I don't know, we call them established Americans. There's always an issue of how to refer to them, you know, long established Americans of whatever race and ethnicity, and how they're responding and reacting to immigration, and how how they're seeing it, how it affects how they see them, how it affects how they see themselves and others. So it raises a lot of questions.
Great, we're gonna go to Harry Frey. Would you like to ask your question? And all of the panelists can have a chance to answer as well.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much, Professor Foner and panelists. I am completely sold on this book, really looking forward to reading it and sharing it with a lot of my relatives who still think I'm studying like migration of birds or butterflies or something. I think they'll appreciate it. I heard you and Professor Garip as well discussing the sort of change in demographics of the various political parties, and how, you know, speaking with some concern about how more Hispanic voters are moving to the Republican Party, and just now about how some African Americans are starting to associate more with Southern whites. And I guess it makes me a bit uncomfortable to hear about this concern for people moving to different parties instead of thinking about how immigration might be affecting these parties' policies. And I was wondering if you might be able to discuss that a bit too, the effects of immigration on, I mean, Professor Kasinitz mentioned redistribution and some of the policies that might seem a bit too progressive now, and how that might change in the near future.
Who wants to talk?
Yeah, does one of the panelists want to start out? Or Nancy, if you had thoughts.
Oh, okay. The politics. So, you know, I think that some of that, you know, how are immigrants changing politics? Well, I mean, I think that's something we have to see increasingly in the future. We certainly, if you look at this city level here, I didn't do that much in the book, I have to say. But if you look at the city level, New York is a perfect case, right? I mean, New York City just passed a law, you know, the city council is giving, you know, immigrants who don't have citizenship the right to vote. That's 800,000 people. It's going to have an impact on New York City politics. So I think that, and partly that happened because there are more city councilors of immigrant origin on the council. They couldn't pass it before. So, you know, and certainly in cities that are, we see there'll be changes in politics. And I think actually, if you look nationally, I mean, there's a Hispanic caucus, there's the Asian American Pacific, you know, caucus. There's the Black caucus. They sometimes get together as the Tri-Caucus. Now, how much impact they have been trying to have a political impact. Will they have more of a political impact as their numbers grow? Maybe, you know, we have to see. But I think that that is something, you know, we have to, I think they will, actually. And the other question is to what extent they support measures that are about immigration, and this is the other issue, is that the issues are issues for all people, you know, all working class people, or all people who have certain concerns about education, for example, or labor, or childcare, or education. And so that they're not just immigrant issues, they're issues that are of concern to a wider public, and that they will make coalitions based on that. I think it's, you know, it's something we should be looking at. Yeah, well, the New York City, anyway, I don't know, Filiz, if you wanted to talk about that.
Nancy, the way I understand his question, Harry's question, is that it's not just that immigrants are now becoming more democratic or more Republican. It is that their presence in that party shall lead to fundamental transformations of what it means to be the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and how that might come about, and how that then downstream eventually shape policy choices that each party shall support or shall reject.
Well, that's a more complicated issue. And it's complicated by the fact that there's immigrants who are voting, right? But also, what about, the second generation? Do they still see them? I mean, they're Americans, right? Who may not they may have different concerns, right? Or I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. We'll have to look into the future and see what happens.
Do we have time for more questions, Van, or what do you think?
I think at this point, I would love to provide all the panelists a final chance to say anything they would like, and end with Nancy as the last person. Any advice, words of wisdom you have for the immigration future of our country? All right. I guess the answer is no. Nancy, do you have the final
Okay,
words?
well, I guess that to end on a different note, I think, one issue, if we're talking about immigration in the future, is how much immigration there's going to be in the future, right? So, I mean, that is an issue. I always assume, that immigrants will keep coming. Well, I think they will. I mean, after all, if Trump gets elected again, or Ron DeSantis, the Republicans get elected, they may, after all, Biden, one of the things that he's been doing is changing a lot of these executive measures by which the Trump administration tried to cut immigration, including the public charge, on the public charge, which I don't know if any of you know, Migration Policy Institute recently had a paper about all the changes that we're not really aware of under the Biden administration, because they're not legislative changes, they're executive order changes. And they are making it, there will be more immigration as a result of it. They are going to be, there'll be more immigrants coming in. But what happens if the Republicans come back, right, in 2024, and they just go right ahead and reinstate the public charge, right? And they do all, and they because they're promising, and they're promising their constituents that, that they're going to cut down on immigration, they're going to cut down on immigration. On the other hand, I mean, and this is another issue, so that politically, they may do that, right? But the question is, what about some of the economic demands? I mean, how we know that fertility is low in the US, that by the year 2030, the baby boomers will all be 65 and older. And so what's going to happen? They're going to need people for the workforce. They're going to need people to pay into Social Security. There's going to be an elderly population that is growing. Who's going to care for them? And there'll be pressure from employers too. Now, will they turn to guest worker programs to do all this? I don't know. But we also know that guest worker programs from the European, led to a lot of permanent immigration. They all didn't go home at the end. I'm just throwing some of this out, but I mean, that's a big issue. Are we going to have continued immigration at fairly, they may not be the high levels that we've seen recently, but they may be still substantial, because that will make a difference too in terms of the impact that immigrants will have. Because how many, will there be a substantial number of immigrants coming? So, I mean, there's a lot that we can't predict. We can say, this may or may not happen. What pressures maybe politicians may be feeling from different constituents in different parts of the, big business versus, the white working class voters who support Trump. I don't know. We have to see. But that is an issue to think about for the future. I mean, one issue in the years ahead is how will there be substantial immigration, and how will it continue? Will it continue? And then I guess people talked about also another issue is, how much will the pandemic and the after effects of the pandemic have an impact on immigrants and their children? you know, it's something that I grappled with as I was writing the book. You know, I talked all about these, you know, immigrants reviving main streets and, you know, opening all these businesses, but, you know, a lot of them closed and didn't survive. Will there be immigrants, you know, opening new businesses? Will they, you know, how much will, you know, some of the sectors that were really badly hit were immigrant sectors, you know, hotels, talk about nail salons, I guess someone mentioned, but a lot of these service industries, you know, restaurants, you know, they've been badly hit. And then I guess, Filiz, you mentioned the issue of how much if people are working at home, will that affect, you know, the need for childcare workers? I mean, there's, you know, so that's an issue also to think of, you know, that we don't know, is how much ultimately the pandemic will have an impact on immigrants' well-being, and how much, you know, and how much the changes, I maybe put it a different way, the changes that they brought, will they continue, you know, will they no longer bring those, you know, will those changes be undone in a way? You know, people are talking about the rise in crime rates. You know, I was careful to say, you know, they're still pretty low by historic standards, but, you know, one of the, you know, we talked about in the, you know, immigrants are good for, you know, lower, or have very low rates of crime, right? And so they're good for neighborhoods, but maybe I don't know what will happen in the future, you know, so anyway, just to throw out some other things to end on, and to think about in terms of how immigration the changes that it may bring in the future. So maybe to end on that note. So I think that's it for me. Yeah. And to thank everybody again for coming. Let me just say, and to thank Phil and Mary and Filiz for their wonderful comments, and to Goda for organizing this, and Van for organizing it, and for everybody to come. And I really appreciate it. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks to all of our speakers, and thanks everyone for attending. We have such great attendance. It's in half right now because we're towards the end, but it was very high. Thank you, everyone. Van put the link in the chat for future events, so we look forward to seeing you later this semester.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye.
Okay, bye. I know, too bad we can't all have a drink afterwards, but
And a bagel.
I know, and a bagel, yeah.
Thank
Bye.
you, Mary.
Okay,
Thank you,
bye-bye.
Filiz. Bye,
Take care.
Phil.